Operation Mincemeat. During the Second World War, British intelligence pulled off one of the most elaborate deception operations ever conceived. The plan was simple in concept, but extraordinary in execution. They took the body of a deceased Welshman, dressed him as a Royal Marines officer, and gave him a false identity as Major William Martin. Fake documents were placed on his body, suggesting the Allies planned to invade Greece and Sardinia rather than Sicily, which was their actual target. The body was released from a submarine off the coast of Spain in April of 1943, where it washed ashore and was found by local authorities. Spanish officials with ties to Nazi Germany allowed German intelligence to photograph the documents before returning them. Hitler was convinced. He redirected significant German forces away from Sicily. When the real invasion came, in July of 1943, Allied casualties were far lower than they would have been. A dead man had changed the course of the war. Operation Wrath of God. After the massacre of 11 Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics, Israel launched a decade-long covert campaign to find and kill every person responsible. The operation was authorized by Prime Minister Golda Meir and carried out by Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency. Small teams of operatives were dispatched across Europe and beyond, tracking down members of the Palestinian group Black September one by one. The assassinations were methodical, often carried out in the middle of European cities using pistols, letter bombs, and carefully placed explosives. Not every mission succeeded. In one case in Norway, the team killed the wrong man entirely, leading to arrests and a rare public embarrassment for Mossad. But the campaign continued for years. It was less about punishment and more about sending a message that attacks on Israeli citizens would be answered, no matter how long it took or how far the targets ran. Operation Anthropoid. In 1942, two Greek soldiers trained by British Special Operations were parachuted into Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia with a mission that seemed almost suicidal. Their target was Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most powerful and feared men in the Third Reich, often described as the architect of the Holocaust. Joseph Gabčík and Jan Kubis tracked his movements for months, living in hiding while being sheltered by local resistance families at enormous personal risk to those families. On the morning of the 27th of May, they ambushed his open-top car on a curved road in Prague. The attack nearly failed. Gabčík's gun jammed, but Kubis threw a modified anti-tank grenade that wounded Heydrich fatally. He died 8 days later. The reprisals from the Nazis were devastating, with entire villages destroyed in response. Both operatives were eventually cornered and died in a church crypt after a prolonged gunfight. They never escaped, but the mission succeeded, making Heydrich the highest-ranking Nazi official to be assassinated during the entire war. Operation Eagle Claw. In April of 1980, the United States attempted a military rescue of 52 American hostages who had been held in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran since November of 1979. The plan was complex and involved multiple helicopter teams flying deep into Iranian territory, staging in the desert, and then moving on Tehran under cover of darkness. It fell apart almost immediately. 3 of the 8 helicopters experienced mechanical failures. The minimum number needed to proceed was 6, and the mission commander made the call to abort. During the withdrawal, one helicopter collided with a transport aircraft on the ground in the Iranian desert, killing 8 American servicemen. The failed mission was a significant blow to the Carter administration and arguably influenced the outcome of that year's presidential election. It also led to a complete overhaul of American Special Operations Forces, eventually resulting in the creation of more specialized and better coordinated units, built specifically for this kind of mission. Operation Entebbe. On the 4th of July, 1976, Israeli commandos carried out a rescue mission at Entebbe Airport in Uganda that lasted just over an hour and is still studied in military schools around the world. A week earlier, an Air France flight had been hijacked by Palestinian militants and redirected to Uganda, where dictator Idi Amin offered them safe harbor. Over 100 hostages were separated by nationality, with non-Jewish passengers released and Israeli and Jewish passengers kept behind. Israel's response was to plan a raid from scratch, using intelligence gathered in days. Hercules transport aircraft flew nearly 4,000 kilometers, landing in the dark at Entebbe. The lead commando team drove to the terminal in a black Mercedes to mimic Amin's motorcade. The fighting was brief and fierce. 102 hostages were rescued. 3 hostages died, and all 7 hijackers were killed. The only Israeli commando killed was the mission's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu, the older brother of future Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Operation Gold? In the mid-1950s, the CIA and British MI6 dug a tunnel from West Berlin into East Berlin for the purpose of tapping into Soviet military communication cables buried underground. The tunnel was over 500 meters long, took months to construct, and was an engineering achievement built entirely in secret beneath a city divided by ideology and suspicion. For nearly a year, intelligence from the tapped cables flowed back to Western analysts. What neither side publicly acknowledged for decades was that the Soviets knew about the tunnel from the very beginning. A British intelligence officer named George Blake, who had been involved in the planning, was a Soviet double agent. The KGB chose not to expose the tunnel immediately because doing so would have revealed Blake as their source. So they let it run. When they finally staged a theatrical discovery of the tunnel in April of 1956, they presented it as proof of Western aggression while quietly protecting the man who had handed them the secret from the start. Operation Ryan. Not all daring covert operations end in success or even produce useful results. Operation Ryan was a Soviet intelligence program launched in the early 1980s under the belief, held at the highest levels of the KGB, that the United States was genuinely planning a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. KGB stations around the world were ordered to watch for signs of imminent attack, from unusual activity at military bases to changes in the routines of American officials. The paranoia reached a peak in November of 1983 during a NATO military exercise called Able Archer, which simulated the procedures for nuclear release. Soviet intelligence, already wound tight, interpreted parts of the exercise as potentially real. Some Soviet forces were quietly placed on higher alert. Western intelligence only learned the full extent of Soviet fear years later. The episode is now considered one of the closest moments the Cold War came to accidental nuclear conflict. Not through aggression, but through 2 superpowers fundamentally misreading each other. Operation Overlord's double-cross system. Before the largest seaborne invasion in history could succeed, the Allies needed the Germans to believe it was happening somewhere else entirely. The double-cross system was a British intelligence program that had, over several years, turned virtually every German spy operating in Britain into a double agent. These men and women fed carefully crafted false information back to German handlers, building credibility over time so that when it mattered most, the Germans would trust what they were told. In the lead-up to D-Day in June of 1944, the double agents reported that the real invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing point from England to France, not Normandy. General George Patton, one of the commanders the Germans most feared, was placed in nominal command of a fictional army group positioned opposite Calais to reinforce the deception. Even after the landings at Normandy began, Hitler held back reinforcements for weeks, still convinced the real blow was coming elsewhere. The deception saved thousands of lives. Operation Paperclip? When the Second World War ended in Europe in 1945, a quiet race began between the United States and the Soviet Union to capture something that had no obvious face but enormous value: German scientific expertise. Operation Paperclip was the American program that recruited over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians and brought them to the United States, often giving them new identities and cleared records that obscured their wartime activities. Among them was Wernher von Braun, who had overseen the development of the V-2 rocket using forced labor from concentration camps. In America, he became the lead figure behind the Saturn V rocket that eventually took astronauts to the moon. The moral compromises embedded in the program were significant and were actively concealed from the public and from President Truman himself at various stages. The scientists who came through Paperclip shaped American aerospace, military, and intelligence capabilities for decades. Operation Gladio. Beneath the surface of post-war Western Europe, NATO and several intelligence agencies constructed a network of secret stay-behind cells intended to operate as resistance forces in the event of a Soviet invasion. The operation was coordinated across multiple countries, each with its own hidden caches of weapons, communications equipment, and trained personnel. Italy had one of the largest and most controversial of these networks, known there as Gladio. For decades, the existence of these cells was denied entirely. When the Italian government finally acknowledged Gladio in 1990, it triggered a wave of investigations across Europe. Some researchers and official inquiries found evidence suggesting that elements of these networks had been involved in acts of political violence and terrorism during the Cold War, working not against Soviet invasion, but against domestic political movements. The full truth of what Gladio did or did not do in peacetime remains one of the most contested questions in modern European history. Operation Neptune Spear. On the 1st of May, 2011, a team of United States Navy SEALs flew by helicopter from Afghanistan into Pakistan and raided a compound in the city of Abbottabad. Their target was Osama bin Laden, the founder of Al-Qaeda, and the man behind the September 11th attacks nearly a decade earlier. The compound had been identified through years of painstaking intelligence work, much of it centered on tracking a trusted courier. Pakistani authorities were not informed of the raid in advance. The operation lasted under 40 minutes. One helicopter suffered a mechanical failure and was deliberately destroyed on-site to prevent its technology from being examined. Bin Laden was found on an upper floor and shot dead. His body was taken, identified through DNA testing within hours, and buried at sea. The mission was carried out with no American casualties. It closed a chapter that had defined a decade of global conflict, though the broader struggle it was part of did not end with him. Operation EJ. In September of 1943, German paratroopers and special forces carried out one of the most audacious rescue missions of the war. Their target was Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator who had been deposed by his own government in July and was being held prisoner in a remote mountain hotel at the top of the Gran Sasso Massif in the Apennines. Hitler ordered that Mussolini be freed, and SS officer Otto Skorzeny led the mission. With no runway available and the terrain too steep for a conventional landing, the rescue team landed gliders directly on the steep rocky slope beside the hotel. The guards, taken completely by surprise, offered almost no resistance. Mussolini was bundled into a small aircraft that barely had the space or weight capacity to carry him and flown out. The entire operation took about 4 minutes on the ground. Mussolini was reinstalled as a German puppet ruler in northern Italy, though his second time in power lasted less than 2 years before he was captured and executed by Italian partisans. Operation Vengeance. In April of 1943, American codebreakers intercepted a detailed travel itinerary for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of the Japanese Imperial Navy and the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The message revealed that Yamamoto would be making an inspection tour of Japanese bases in the South Pacific on a specific date, traveling by aircraft with a fighter escort. American commanders made the decision to intercept and shoot him down. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters flew a carefully calculated low-altitude route over the Pacific, avoiding radar detection for over 400 miles, to reach Yamamoto's flight path at precisely the right moment. The timing was almost perfect. His aircraft was shot down over the jungle of Bougainville Island. Yamamoto was found dead in the wreckage, still seated in his chair, his white glove resting on the hilt of his sword. His death was a significant blow to Japanese military morale and removed one of their most experienced and strategically gifted commanders. Operation Colossus. In February of 1941, British forces carried out the first airborne raid in British military history, dropping a small team of paratroopers into southern Italy with the objective of destroying an ancient stone aqueduct that supplied water to a large portion of the Italian population and, more importantly, to the port of Brindisi and several Italian airfields. The mission was the brainchild of a young military planner and was regarded as highly experimental, since mass parachute assaults had barely been tested at that point in the war. The team successfully demolished a section of the aqueduct, though the damage turned out to be repaired faster than anticipated. Most of the men were captured shortly afterward and spent the rest of the war as prisoners. Despite the mixed results, the operation demonstrated that small airborne teams could strike deep inside enemy territory, a principle that shaped the development of special operations doctrine across all Allied forces throughout the rest of the war. Operation Chariot. On the night of the 27th of March, 1942, a British force rammed an obsolete destroyer packed with concealed explosives directly into the only dry dock on the Atlantic coast, capable of servicing Germany's most powerful battleship, the Tirpitz. The dock was at Saint-Nazaire in occupied France, and destroying it would force the Tirpitz to return to Norway for repairs if she was ever damaged, removing the threat of her breaking into the Atlantic shipping lanes. The destroyer, HMS Campbelltown, was disguised to resemble a German vessel to delay detection for as long as possible. She rammed the dock gates at full speed just after 1 in the morning. Commandos who came ashore with her fought through the heavily defended port to destroy pumping equipment and other facilities before being overwhelmed. The delayed explosives in the ship's hull detonated the following afternoon, while German officers were inspecting the wreck, killing over 300 people. The dock was put out of action for the rest of the war. The raid cost the lives of many of the men who carried it out, and over 80 were awarded decorations for gallantry. Thank you for watching. If you learned something from this video, consider supporting me by liking this video and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.